this magnitude has ever been done in the history of medicine before.
Unsung victories in the fight against disease.
Tuesday at 14 and 21 GMT. And in 60 minutes, the documentary.
The power of words in the story of modern China, and how China's tenacious Communist Party has used words to shape the country. I'm Celia Hatton. The party's political slogans can mean hope or fear for millions of people.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 17 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson. A race to find survivors with hundreds of people still missing in Europe's floods.
There was landslides, rocks and soil all over the roads, trees down, cars upside down, people crying and hugging each other.
Our correspondent interviews the Taliban at peace talks with the Afghan government in Doha.
We can win militarily.
Can you? The government has protected the cities in a much more powerful way than the districts that you've overrun.
We have not tried to attack the cities.
The head of the Olympics responds to street protests against the Games in Tokyo. Champion boxer Manny Pacquiao is ousted as leader of the ruling party of the Philippines, and Google Maps is accused of sending hikers up a potentially fatal mountain path. You're listening to the BBC World Service, live from London.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Thousands of emergency workers and volunteers continue to search for those still missing after some of the worst flooding to hit northwestern Europe in decades. The German authorities have warned more victims may be found in flooded cellars, cars or in collapsed buildings. Army vehicles have been helping to winch cars from out of the water and clear some of the vast piles of debris. Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill sent this report from a district in Rhineland-Palatinate reeling from the disaster.
In Ahrweiler, everything and everyone is covered in thick, sticky mud. 90 people have been confirmed dead in this district alone. When you walked the centre of town, past the fire engines and mounds of dirty, broken furniture, you can see why. The main bridge is in ruins, broken by the sheer force of the floods. Even as we watched, part of the bank broke off and slid into the fast-flowing river. Many people are still unaccounted for, and emergency workers using amphibious vehicles continue their search and rescue, though it's feared that's fast becoming a recovery operation only.
More than 160 people are known to have died in the floods, mainly in Germany and Belgium, but there's also been widespread damage in Switzerland, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. Anna Holligan begins her report in Belgium.
The Prime Minister has declared the 20th of July a national day of mourning. He said the floods, which have claimed at least 20 lives in Belgium, could be the most catastrophic the country has ever seen. Across the border in the Netherlands, the emergency services are still trying to reconnect power supplies. This country has lots of experience and talent keeping the rising tide at bay, but parts of the country are already 10 metres below sea level. And what the past few days of heavy rainfall have proved is there are limits to what sophisticated engineering is capable of.
Afghan government sources have told the BBC that peace negotiations with the Taliban in the Qatari capital Doha have got off to a good start. A Taliban spokesman, Suhail Shaheen, denied the group was bent on a military solution.
We are committed to bring about a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. But right now, we have not concluded the peace deal. Our policy is clear, and that is liberating our country. Our policy is not killing our own people. That's not our policy. If there is any collateral damage, we are investigating that.
The Afghan government has called on Pakistan to ensure the safety of its diplomats and their families. The statement came after the daughter of the Afghan ambassador was assaulted and kidnapped in the capital, Islamabad, on Friday. Relations between the two countries have been deteriorating as the violence in Afghanistan escalates. World News from the BBC. An opposition activist in Venezuela has taken refuge in the Chilean embassy amid a wave of arrests of political adversaries of President Nicolas Maduro. Emilio Grateron tweeted his thanks to those who'd saved him, while the Chilean Foreign Ministry said it had taken in the former mayor at the request of the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó. The Venezuelan security forces have arrested the leader of the opposition party, Popular Will. The United Nations has called on Tanzania to stop forcibly repatriating refugees fleeing the Islamist insurgency in Mozambique. Nearly 750,000 people have been displaced by the 4-year conflict in northern Mozambique. More details from Mary Harper.
The UN Refugee Agency says nearly 10,000 people have been forced back from Tanzania. Those trying to cross a river on the border have been blocked. They're stranded, sleeping outside in the cold with no blankets. The UN says the few refugees who have managed to stay in Tanzania have received no food, medicine or shelter. There are also obstacles preventing help from reaching the 750,000 people displaced within Mozambique, nearly half of whom are children.
President Biden has said his administration will appeal against a ruling by a federal judge that a program protecting migrants who came to the US as children is illegal. Judge Andrew Hannon said the former President Barack Obama had exceeded his authority when he created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals by executive order, and that the government should stop accepting people onto the program. Scientists studying the genome of cannabis say it was first domesticated in China and not in Central Asia as generally thought. They say the variants used now for textiles, medicine and as a recreational drug diverged from the main gene pool about 4,000 years ago. The research is published in the journal Science Advances. BBC News.
You're listening to the Newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Ritson. Germany is assessing the damage wrought by catastrophic flooding. Its president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, has already met some of the victims.
We see places, we see communities that are marked by devastation and destruction. Much is lost and not easily remade. But the biggest loss is borne by those who've lost relatives in the floods. We mourn with those who've lost their friends, acquaintances or relatives. Their fate tears our hearts apart.
More than 150 people are known to have died, most of those in Germany, and there's a race to find survivors. Hundreds of troops are also helping clear roads and debris in the western German states of Rhineland-Palatinate and the North Rhine-Westphalia. Craig Cousins was staying in Beisweiler and trying to drive back to Britain.
It seemed like every road that I tried to go down, either the road was just completely washed away or there was bridges down or it was just completely flooded. There was landslides, rocks and soil all over the roads, trees down. There was cars upside down, just debris everywhere. All of the barriers at the side of the roads had all been ripped out. There was people crying and hugging each other, just standing around looking in total shock.
Let's talk to our correspondent Damien McGuinness in Nuremberg in Germany. Damien, what's the latest?
Yeah, well, the death toll tragically just keeps on rising, Alex. So the latest figures are that in Germany alone now, there are more than 150 people have died in the flooding just here in Germany. The reason why the death toll keeps rising is that as the waters recede, and that's what's happening, there's no rain in this region right now. The rivers are going down and the water is draining slowly from those roads. Tragically, we're discovering bodies. Where I'm standing right now, I'm by a donation centre, and it's also a coordination centre for volunteers who've been out all day with emergency rescue services looking for people, looking for missing people. I can see them not far from me now coming back, covered in mud, looking very tired indeed. Some of these people will have found bodies in the water as it recedes. That's the tragic reality that we're facing here in Germany. And the difficulty is, as you heard from that interview just now, it's still a dangerous situation because of the collapsing infrastructure. So over the past 12 hours, really, we've still seen roads being destroyed, some bridges collapsing. We've also seen landslides. Yesterday, there was a very severe landslide which pushed away some houses. This is happening in pockets throughout this region of Germany, Rhineland-Palatinate, which is the state hardest hit by this catastrophe.
And as the politicians visit, the reconstruction is getting underway in places. Anyway.
Yeah, the reconstruction. Yeah, that's right. The reconstruction is going pretty quickly, and it has to really, because people's houses have been destroyed. So when you go through the villages and towns in the valleys that have been affected, there's just debris everywhere. It looks like a war zone. It's a horrific sight. If you go uphill a little bit, a lot of the towns there look completely unaffected. That's the reality of what often happens in flood zones. And what's happening now is that volunteers are organising donations, sending to people supplies, people who've lost everything, who need supplies to survive. At the same time, the houses that have been either partially destroyed or which have had water rushing through them and all the contents destroyed, they have to be at least cleaned up and made livable again. So what you're finding in a lot of these villages as well, neighbours, friends, families are coming together to help the houses particularly affected, and you have dozens of people coming to people in the village who have been really hit hard, and everyone mucking in to get the mud and the water out of these houses. It's a big job. As you say now, the politicians have been arriving today. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier was expressing his deep, deep sorrow as what's happened. He said he feels in a state of shock. And then tomorrow, Chancellor Angela Merkel will be coming here to this region here in Rhineland-Palatinate. She'll be coming to a small village called Schuld, which is very near where I'm talking to you now. And that is the tragic scenes there, where houses have been completely destroyed and ripped apart by the flooding. And that's what she's going to look at tomorrow. She was in the US visiting President Biden when the floods happened. She's now got back and she's going straight to the flood zones that are affected.
Damien, thank you. Damien McGuinness in Nuremberg in Germany. As the Afghan government negotiators begin peace talks with the Taliban in Doha, they were very downbeat about the prospects for a deal that would suit both sides. In the short time since US-led forces have withdrawn from the country, the Taliban have made significant military advances. But after the first round, the government side has said the talks have been positive. Let's talk to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who is in Doha. Lise, what has enabled the Afghan government to say the talks have been positive?
Well, I think what they were referring to was that first of all, the fact that they are actually taking place. A high-level political delegation has come from Kabul, joining the regular team of negotiators who are here and have been talking on and off to the Taliban since last September. And given the way the Taliban have been overrunning districts across Afghanistan, seizing strategic border crossings, and in general giving off a triumphal air, I think the government negotiators were pleased that there was as they put it, a positive start to the negotiations, a feeling that the Taliban were trying to engage constructively and believe that there was worth in trying to find a political way out.
And you have interviewed the Taliban spokesman, Suhail Shaheen.
Yes, and they're very defensive because of this growing sense that they are bent on a military victory and growing concern about some of the reports that are emerging from areas, the districts under their control, that they're returning to the harsh ways of the 1990s. And of course, so the pressure is on, both from Afghans and from Afghanistan's neighbors, for the Taliban, for the government to make progress on these talks. So when I was speaking to Suhail Shaheen, the Taliban spokesperson, who's a member of the negotiating team, he blamed the government for the slow pace of the talks.
They are saying this thing to put the blame on us because of the slow progress in the negotiation.
But this spirit of the Taliban delegation is that you believe you've won, and it's just a question of sorting out the details now. Is that how you approach it?
The strengths of our strengths, our capabilities, that we can win militarily. That's something else.
Can you? The government has protected the cities in a much more powerful way than the districts that you've overrun.
We have not tried to attack the cities.
So that's the Taliban spokesman, Suhail Shaheen. An ominous-sounding clip, Lise. I mean, is there a realistic hope of a deal that both sides could live with?
Their worldviews are very far apart. The government, the negotiators for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan want to keep what has been achieved in the past 20 years, which includes an election, a parliamentary system, an elected president, a constitution which protects the rights of women and girls and human rights. The Taliban, emboldened by their military victory, have been making clear what their vision is. It's one which doesn't have elections. They don't believe in elections. They want a political structure which is headed by an Islamic figure. They want a constitution which is more Islamic than the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So the government negotiators say to me that their gaps are very wide, but everyone knows that if these talks fail, the war will get much, much worse.
Lise, thank you. Lise Doucette in Doha. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Debbie has the headlines.
The search for those still missing following the devastating floods in Germany and Belgium continues, with the German army winching submerged cars from the waters. The Afghan government and the Taliban have said only a political solution will end the violence in the country as they resumed peace talks. And the UN Refugee Agency has told Tanzania it must stop turning back people trying to flee the violence in Mozambique.
The Tokyo Olympics are only 6 days away, and the first case of the coronavirus has been confirmed in the Olympic Village. The Games' organisers have not disclosed the nationality of the infected person, but they have been keen to reassure the athletes and the sceptical Japanese public that the Olympic Games will be safe. The Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach said he understood people's concern and was trying to regain their trust through very strict anti-COVID measures. He hoped success on home soil would shift the mood in Japan too.
We are also confident that once the Japanese people will see the Japanese athletes performing in these Olympic Games and hopefully even successfully performing in these Olympic Games, the attitude may become less emotional, for not saying less aggressive.
Our reporter Steve Holden told me more about the person who has tested positive for coronavirus.
The organisers of the Games would only confirm it is a visitor from abroad working for the Olympics, i.e. not an athlete. They've just said that this person tested positive during a routine check on Friday. They're now in self-isolation, and we would assume that all the people that they've been in close contact with are also being tested as a priority.
Were this to get into the village, presumably it could derail entire competitions.
Completely. This is the worry because it's made its way into the village itself. But the Games does have a huge logistical dossier. It's called their playbook, and it's issued to everybody who's involved in the Games, from athletes to volunteers. And it documents every contingency around COVID. So there's all the common sense stuff like mask wearing, social distancing, but then each individual sport has its own plans for what happens if there's a COVID case. So now in the case of wrestling, as an example, say there's 2 wrestlers, one tests positive, they are then out of the competition. They're not disqualified, they are marked down as a do not start, but they are out. The other person is then tested and they can progress to the next round. Now, say somebody gets to the next round and then they test positive, so they get to the final, they're out, and the person they defeated in the previous round, as long as they have a negative test, gets a bye to the final. So they don't want to derail entire games, entire competitions, because if you come into close contact with a competitor who has a positive test, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be out of the games yourself.
Briefly, normally when the Olympics is held somewhere, the local population is delighted and excited. It's not the case this time, is it?
No spectators whatsoever, very controlled bubbles. The opening ceremony, I can't imagine what that's going to be like without the atmosphere of the raucous crowd cheering on all the competitors. And as you mentioned, the Japanese public very sceptical about this going ahead. And what Thomas Bach said about, he was confident that once the Japanese athletes would start being successful, then people's attitudes may change. I mean, that's a lot of pressure on Japanese athletes to bring home the gold medals, basically saying, come on, have a gold rush and then get behind it. I don't know whether at this stage, with such a sceptical audience, whether that's going to do anything. But, let's judge it in a couple of weeks' time when the games are in full flow. Maybe attitudes would change.
Steve Holden. From Monday, UK citizens with 2 COVID jabs will no longer have to isolate at home after returning to England and Wales from countries designated as medium risk, those on the amber list in the traffic light system for international travel. But the relaxation will not apply to people returning from one of those countries, France, because of concern over cases of the Beta or South African variant there. France, though, like many other places, is mainly seeing a surge in the Delta variant of COVID-19. So, why the worry? Is the Beta variant more dangerous to people who've been vaccinated? James Gallagher is our health correspondent.
It's not. There are 2 things you really look at when you're looking at the new variants. What are they doing? 2 main properties. One is, do they spread faster? And that's what we saw with Alpha, the one that arose in Kent. And that's what we've seen in Delta as well. They just spread far faster than the other variants. And that's why they're taking over everywhere that they've been. But the other property that you look at is how good they are at evading the immune system. So if you've been vaccinated, if you've already been infected with a different variant of COVID, how good is a new variant at getting around that? And Beta seems to be the best of the bunch at evading the immune system. Now, I'm not saying that it's always going to overcome vaccination, but it's more likely that you would get an infection if you were exposed to Beta, even if you've been vaccinated, than if you're exposed to the other variants. You're still far less likely to need hospital treatment. But as you mentioned right at the beginning, the variant that is taking over in France, the one that is massively increasing, is Delta. And that's the one that is everywhere here too.
James Gallagher. And in another development, Britain's health minister has announced that he has tested positive for the virus. Sajid Javid said he had mild symptoms having been vaccinated. The Philippines' ruling party has voted out its leader, the champion boxer Manny Pacquiao, the latest development in an unfolding drama between Mr. Pacquiao and President Rodrigo Duterte. Here's Celia Hatton.
One of the coziest political partnerships in the Philippines has come to a dramatic end. In the past, the country's outspoken president, Rodrigo Duterte, enjoyed the consistent support of Manny Pacquiao, a world champion boxer who also doubles as a senator. But last month, Mr. Pacquiao publicly criticized his one-time ally, questioning why Duterte didn't do more to counter China's claims in the South China Sea or to battle endemic corruption. Many expect him to throw his hat in the ring for next year's presidential race, though right now Pacquiao is away in the U.S., preparing to enter another ring, ahead of a welterweight title boxing match.
Celia Hatton. Debbie has some other stories from our news desk.
President Bashar al-Assad of Syria has taken the oath of office for a 4th term in a ceremony in Damascus. Official figures gave Mr. Assad 95% of the vote in May, but the US and a number of other countries dismissed it as a sham. 10 years after the war in Syria began, Mr. Assad now controls, with Russian and Iranian support, the main cities in the country. Germany's men's Olympic football team has walked off the pitch in what was billed as a friendly against Honduras, saying one of their players had been racially abused. They said their central defender, Jordan Torunariga, was targeted minutes before the game was due to end. And Greece is imposing a nighttime curfew and banning music in shops, cafes and beach bars on the tourist island of Mykonos to subdue rising COVID cases. Mykonos, a resort favoured by celebrities, attracts 1 million visitors a year, and its mayor said the restrictions in the middle of the tourism season were misguided.
Debbie, thank you. It seems that Google Maps has been directing those who want to climb some of Britain's highest mountains along extremely dangerous routes. The newsroom's Terry Egan is here. Terry, this is extraordinary.
Yes, Alex, this does have a funny side, but more importantly, it could be very dangerous. It seems Google Maps has been suggesting routes up Ben Nevis that are potentially fatal. Now, Ben Nevis is the UK's tallest mountain. It's 1,345 metres high, and so is a particular favourite for climbers. But it seems that Google has been directing people to the car park that's nearest the summit, and from there pointing them along the most dangerous route. It would lead them across a steep, rocky, pathless terrain down, and it would be challenging even for a good climber and when there's good visibility. With clouds and rain, it could be lethal. Worse than this, it seems that in one case, a mountain called Unchio in the Northwest Highlands, Google Maps has been suggesting a route that would take you over a cliff.
Right. So what's been the reaction?
Well, now Google has been called out by a Scottish charity, the John Muir Trust, which looks after the UK's highest mountain. That organisation says it often comes across groups of inexperienced walkers heading up the south slopes, which is the exact wrong way for them. It seems it's all too easy for people to follow Google and assume that what it shows here is correct, up to date, and more importantly, safe. But in fact, there have been a number of incidents where downloading routes off the internet have ended up with people having injuries.
In 15 seconds, what's being done about this?
Well, the John Muir Trust and another organisation said that climbers should cross-check any such information with a map, if not with a local guide. They want Google to consult them, and for its part, a Google spokesperson said they'd made changes to its service so that future maps would direct people to a visitor centre instead.
Terry Egan. Tonight brings to a close this year's Cannes Film Festival, and the awards ceremony is getting underway around now. This year's festival was pushed back by 2 months because of COVID, and masks were worn throughout films except on the red carpet. This year, the festival organisers made a big effort to go green, to both reduce the festival's carbon footprint and introduce a new section of films devoted to climate change and the environment. Cannes is seen as lagging in relation to environmental concerns compared to other major world film festivals. Tom Brooke reports from the French Riviera.
When the red carpet leading up to the Palais des Festivals was unrolled this year, something was different. It was made not of PVC, but material that could be recycled. There was a reliance on hybrid or electric cars too at the festival to ferry around the luminaries. There was also the launching of a special section titled Cinema for the Climate, 1 feature film and 6 documentaries. Leading Oscar-winning French actress Marion Cotillard, who produced one of the documentaries, told me she was very impressed by the efforts Cannes had made this year to go green.
It's an amazing thing. They really took decisions and turns that are greener, and I think it's about time, and it's very important that such a huge festival set an example.
Invisible Demons was one of the climate change documentaries unveiled at the festival, with its focus on pollution in New Delhi.
Growing up, I never saw a clean river. To me, rivers were either black or white.
It was directed by Rahul Jain, and it brought festival goers some haunting images.
We see DDT being sprayed in a pristine garden, a riverside area getting flooded by the monsoons. It came from a place of absolute fear and confusion, and I just wanted to find a way to create a film out of this fear.
Another of the documentaries, Bigger Than Us, the one produced by Marion Cotillard, shows Melati Waisen, a young Indonesian plastics pollution activist, globe-trotting, meeting other young campaigners engaged in a range of causes.
How many of you have felt that you have a really good idea?
To Melati, the film inspires.
It's supposed to be a place where you can see yourself in these change makers too. It's where you can understand your role in really creating a difference.
The challenge facing many of these climate films at Cannes is that they are preaching to the converted. Audiences were receptive for the most part to the messages, if perhaps a little sceptical at times. For all the directors in this climate film section at Cannes, there is an urgency that those who work within the world of cinema listen to their calls. Rahul Jain argues that if they don't, there will be no film industry, no production.
If there were ever a time to beat a drum, now would be it. Everything we see in popular culture today, for all of that to exist, we need a planet.
Despite its Go Green efforts, Cannes still has a long way to go. It was helped by pandemic restrictions this year, which meant there were fewer people jetting in from around the world, fewer big parties and premieres, less lavish living, which all served to reduce the festival's carbon footprint. And it did seem that the messages in the Cannes New Climate Film section were hitting home.
Scientists say the last time the planet was this hot, it was hit by a gigantic asteroid that wiped out almost all animal species from the face of the Earth.
An appropriate point on which to end. Tom Brooke with that report. The stars heading down the red carpet, or should that be the green carpet? Right now, we will have a full report from our correspondent at Cannes in the next programme in, 3.5 hours. Thanks for listening.
This is the BBC World Service. Join Alex Krotowski as she meets a Paralympic world record holder.
For long jumper Lex Gillette, trust is everything, and he puts it all in his guide, Wesley Williams.
You have an individual who is out there all by himself. He can't see anything. All he can do is hear. He has to battle the crowd. He has to listen for me. He has an assignment that he has to do as far as counting his steps.
Once I'm at the 16th stride, then I'm ready to fly through the air. Leave the ground, close your eyes, and wait for the sand to come. That extends from that deeper type of relationship that you have with this person who has been an integral part of what you do.
Lex Gillette, A Leap in the Dark. Tuesday at 8 and 19 GMT.
September the 15th, 1940. One of the biggest air battles in history. Over London, hundreds of planes dodge, weave, crash and burn.
We were fighting with our 11 group with our backs to the wall. We were fighting for our existence and the existence of London.
It's the day which will decide the Battle of Britain, perhaps the outcome of the Second World War. Join me, Tuppence Middleton, for the final part of Spitfire, the People's Plane, after the news.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. Emergency work is continuing in Germany and the Benelux countries, which earlier in the week were hit by the worst floods in decades. At least 160 people are known to have died, most of them in western Germany, and officials have warned that more bodies may be found in submerged cars and collapsed buildings. Both sides have sounded a note of cautious optimism at the start of a new round of peace talks between the Afghan government and Taliban militants. The negotiations in Doha take place amid the Taliban seizing more government districts. The Ethiopian police say they have arrested more than 300 people suspected of supporting Tigrayan rebels in the north of the country. The authorities have previously denied targeting people because of their ethnicity. An opposition activist in Venezuela has taken refuge in the Chilean embassy amid a wave of arrests of political adversaries of President Nicolas Maduro. Emilio Grateron tweeted his thanks to those who'd saved him, while the Chilean Foreign Ministry said it had taken him in at the request of the opposition leader Juan Guaido. The Greek authorities are reimposing an overnight curfew and other restrictions on Mykonos to bring a new COVID outbreak under control. The island's economy is heavily dependent on visitors, and the move in the middle of the tourist season has been criticised as misguided. President Biden says he will appeal against a court ruling that declared the Dreamers program illegal. The program protects people who entered the US as illegal child migrants. Scientists studying the genome of cannabis say it was first domesticated in China and not in Central Asia as generally thought. They say the more specialised variants used now for textiles, medicine and as a recreational drug diverged from the main gene pool about 4,000 years ago. BBC News.
Close your eyes and imagine dawn on a glorious late summer's day in the south of England. It's lovely, isn't it? But all this is about to change. Soon the skies above you will be alive with the sound of war, feats of bravery and sacrifice, a great air battle that will prove to be a crucial turning point in the Second World War. It is the 15th of September 1940, the day when the Spitfire became a legend. I'm Tuppence Middleton, and this is Spitfire, the People's Plane. As the sun rises, operation rooms are coming to life. These are the nerve centres that receive reports of enemy aircraft approaching and guide Spitfire pilots to their targets. The operation rooms are staffed by WAAFs, elite members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, smart young women like Peggy Balfour.
During my interview at Farnborough, I was asked what I would like to do in the WAAF. Just anything to do with aircraft, I told the senior WAAF officer. We chatted for quite a while. Then she told me she thought I should go into fighter command as a plotter and work in a sector operations room. I had no idea what that meant. Plotting? Anything to do with spying? Surely not. But fighter command sounded fine. I signed up for that at once.
Peggy plays a vital role in the defence of Britain. The country is protected by a complex system using the very latest in radio technology. It works like this. The new radar stations on the south coast of England detect formations of German bombers as soon as they take off from their bases in France. That information is instantly relayed to Fighter Command headquarters and then to a network of operation rooms where plotters like Peggy mark the movements of the aircraft on a huge map of southern England. Sector station commanders look down on these maps and decide where to send their Spitfire and Hurricane fighter planes. Craig Murray is a curator at Britain's Imperial War Museum.
It's a very skillful job and it's a very high pressure job, constantly having to process new data coming through your earphones, changing these RAID blocks, these little wooden blocks they have on the table, they move around with these croupier sticks. They're updating it with the numbers, the directions, the height of the aircraft is estimated.
Peggy is well aware of the importance of her work. She's just met a boy who flies a Spitfire.
A week or two after we arrived, I went to a dance held in the sergeant's mess. I stood in the doorway of the hall in the shadows, taking stock of my surroundings before venturing in. It all looked great fun.
South of the border, down Mexico way.
The music was playing merrily and everyone seemed to be dancing happily. Then someone came over and asked me to dance with him. He was tall and I found danced beautifully. We danced and chatted and then, I remember, he called across to one of his friends.
Tebby, guess what? I'm dancing with a WAF who's asking about centrifugal force.
46 Squadron disappeared, but before they left, I got to know my first dancing partner quite well, Jack Lawson. I found he never fussed me and danced quite beautifully, completely to my liking.
He actually joined the RAF in 1929. He joined pretty much at the bottom of the rank structure.
Adrian Kerrison is a curator with the Imperial War Museum at Duxford near Cambridge. During the war, it was an important RAF base where Peggy plotted and Jack led a squadron of Spitfires.
He flew with 19 Squadron from Duxford from 1940 and was involved in most of the Battle of Britain. He was actually called Farmer by his squadron mates because he often spoke of being a farmer after the war.
The weather was lovely. The sun shone and it was warm and mild. We went for walks and visited local pubs. We talked and argued and laughed.
As their relationship deepened, war flared up all around them. The Battle of Britain was at its height. Day after day, Jack would fly his Spitfire, attacking bombers set on destroying Britain's defences, ports, radar stations, aircraft factories, and the very airfields where Peggy and her fellow plotters tracked the battle.
June and July were very busy months in ops. I received letters from Jack, written in haste, telling me how the squadrons moved around, how once his aircraft had been shot up and how lucky he'd been, and how, at one airfield they visited, they were able to make use of the swimming pool there. Lovely during the hot weather, but only once. The next day, nothing. It had been blasted to rubble, and they were off again.
German raids were taking their toll. Spitfires are being destroyed on the ground and in the air. Each day is a personal battle against stress, fear, and exhaustion.
Life was difficult enough just staying alive from day to day. That was enough. I used to worry, and his letters made me think. There seemed to be so little respite, and life was so fragile.
By September, Adolf Hitler is losing patience. The invasion of Britain is scheduled for the 20th of September and has to be launched before winter weather makes the crossing of the English Channel too dangerous. The last remnants of the Royal Air Force must be crushed.
They'd seen from their previous assaults on London that the RAF were sending up fewer fighters, so they took this to mean that the RAF didn't have many aircraft left. So they thought by launching two pretty big raids on London on the 15th, that this could be the sort of final hammer blow to destroy the RAF altogether. Basically just getting the bombers to bomb London, and then the fighters would take care of the RAF fighters that would come up to meet them.
It's a plan that might just succeed. In the summer of 1940, the RAF is in crisis. It isn't just the shortage of planes and pilots. There's a catastrophic clash of personalities at the top of Britain's Air Force, pitching a cautious tactician against a reckless national hero. British tactics against the Luftwaffe had until now been simple. When a formation of German bombers was spotted, 2 squadrons of around 20 fighters would typically be scrambled to intercept them before they reached their targets. This damage limitation strategy was now being challenged by a theory known as the Big Wing.
The idea is you can hit them with overwhelming numbers. It doesn't necessarily matter whether they are hitting your targets first or not, as long as you can damage or shoot down as many of them as you can after they leave.
This Big Wing theory is promoted by an influential squadron leader at RAF Duxford, a powerful personality who inspires love and hate in equal measure, Douglas Bader.
We dislike the iron crosses and the crooked sign of the swastika, and anyhow, who the hell were these chaps to come over into our sky and drop bombs on us, on our people?
Douglas Bader joined the RAF in 1928. He proved himself a brilliant but reckless pilot, crashing his plane and almost killing himself as he attempted some low-flying aerobatics. Both of his legs were amputated, but with a new set of prosthetic limbs, he was determined to join the war effort.
The whole point is that you've got to be positive about it, you see, and my attitude is that I'm not disabled and I'm going to kick these bloody legs around the place and make them do what I want.
Given leadership of a squadron at RAF Duxford, Bader decides to try out his Big Wing theory in the Battle of Britain, much to the irritation of the man in charge of the RAF fighters defending London, Keith Park.
We were fighting with our 11 group with our backs to the wall. This wasn't a little game. We were not in a position to try out tactical theories of this and that, big wings or little wings. We were fighting for our existence and the existence of the London and the Empire.
So it's a very efficient system that is winning, and this rogue system from Duxford is rather putting that in jeopardy. By the time they get there, often the Germans have either been and bombed it, or Douglas Bader has decided to take them off somewhere else because he feels the hunting is better elsewhere. And so this gradually causes a huge deal of resentment.
As dawn breaks on September the 15th, hundreds of German fighters and bombers are readied for action on the coast of France. In England, 2 rival camps prepare to face them. To the south, 11 Group, based at RAF Uxbridge, is ready to use the familiar tactics of fast and targeted response. To the north, 12 Group, including RAF Duxford, is committed to the Big Wing approach, attacking the Germans with overwhelming force. Those tactics are about to be tested, along with the courage of WAF plotter Peggy Balfour and of Spitfire pilot Jack Lawson. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill senses that September the 15th will be a big day. He's driven west from London to Uxbridge, where he watches the plotters mark the positions of wave after wave of German bombers.
At this point, things are pretty fraught. I think Churchill asks at one point, what kind of reserves do we have? And Park turns to him and goes, this is it. There are no reserves, this is it. So, especially with the afternoon raid, which is a massive one of well over 500 aircraft, it's tense stuff. It's the sort of make or break day, if you will. So very tense. And I think the Prime Minister would have seen that as well.
Churchill was a journalist long before he was a politician. He writes notes as he watches. These are his words from those notes.
Operations commence!
Presently, the red bulbs showing that the majority of our squadrons were engaged. A subdued hum arose from the floor, where the busy plotters pushed their discs to and from in accordance with the swiftly changing situation. In a little while, all our squadrons were fighting. The lower line of bulbs was out. There was not one squadron left in reserve.
Hostile 2-3 now being intercepted by Spitfires.
The first raiders reached the English coast at 11:30 in the morning. More than 200 aircraft head for London, and as bombs fall on railway junctions, dockyards, and even Buckingham Palace, fierce dogfights break out over the burning city.
The Dorniers didn't particularly fly tight, which was to their disadvantage. If they had done, they'd have had better firepower to beat off the fighters. But RCO went at them in a quarter attack, and more or less went through them and spread them out a bit.
Ray Holmes, British fighter pilot.
I made my attack on this bomber, and he spurted out a lot of oil, just a great stream over my aeroplane, blotting out my windscreen. Then, as the windscreen cleared, I suddenly found myself going straight into his tail. So I stuck my stick forward and went under him, practically grazing my head on his belly.
Jack Lawson, Peggy's boyfriend, was part of Douglas Bader's big wing. They arrive late to the battle, but Jack makes up for lost time.
He basically got ahead of the bomber stream that was bombing London, turned around, and then launched a head-on attack at one of the bombers. He then turned around again, came behind it, and fired at it again, and then the bomber started to drop out of the formation.
The first wave is beaten back, some caught by 11 group fighters before they reach the city, others shot down by the big wing as they dropped their bombs on London. But that was just the start. By 2 o'clock, the second much bigger wave, around 150 bombers and 350 fighters, is on its way to attack London's docks. 276 British fighters are scrambled to meet them.
We saw their planes coming toward us, and it seemed that the whole of the RAF was there. We'd never seen so many British fighters coming at us at once. All around us were dogfights as the fighters went after each other. Then, as we were getting ready for our approach to the target, we saw what must have been 100 RAF fighters coming at us. Where were they coming from? We'd been told that the RAF fighters were very close to extinction.
Hans Zonderland, front gunner of a German Dornier bomber.
I got lost from my squadron, and when I looked, there was not a soul in the sky. And in the distance, I saw some ackak, and I went toward it, and I saw these waves upon waves of German bombers coming in. There seemed to be hundreds of them, and I forgot about anything else. Suddenly, I found aeroplanes whizzing all around me. I'd flown smack into the middle of the fighter escort. Damn fool.
British fighter pilot George Unwin.
The big wing was actually pounced on by fighters that they didn't see. So the effect of the big wing, which was to launch 50 or 60 fighters at a stream of bombers, didn't really work out because they were bounced and everything just turned into melee. Jack Lawson, he ended up chasing a fighter over the channel, hoping to shoot it down, but he got shot up himself and then had to limp back to Falmere. He wrote at the end of his logbook entry for that day that he staggered back and just ended the entry with "thank God."
56 German aircraft were shot down that day. The RAF lost 29. London's docks had been badly hit, and the Luftwaffe still had plenty of planes in reserve. So who had won? The British and their allies, or the Germans? And within the RAF, had Douglas Bader and his big wing proven their tactical superiority?
At full strength, a big wing would be about 60 aeroplanes. They find they're getting in each other's way, so they have to keep stopping and pulling out, in case they collide with each other.
In military terms, the 15th of September was a minor victory for the RAF, but it quickly proved to have enormous consequences.
And more than anything, it was a psychological victory. It really made the Germans sort of rethink everything. It made them postpone the invasion, and it just basically made them realize that they could not establish aerial superiority over Britain.
With the RAF still in control of the skies over England, Hitler believed that invasion was impossible. On September the 17th, it was postponed indefinitely. German attention turned east to the Soviet Union, and Britain would live to fight again. Jack Lawson and Peggy Balfour both survived the day, but a year later, Jack's Spitfire would be shot down by a Messerschmitt 109 over Rotterdam harbour as the RAF took the battle into occupied Europe. Peggy lived until the year 2000, 60 years after the Battle of Britain. She never married.
Standing here, I suddenly knew that no one else would ever take Jack's place. For me, that was it forever. I didn't tell him. not wanting him to think about anything else but flying.
Thank you for listening to Spitfire, the People's Plane, from the BBC World Service. I'm Tuppence Middleton. The producers are Emily Knight, Alistair Cross, and Chris Ledyard. Research is by Lisa Lipman, and the commissioning editor is Steve Titherington. Thanks to our historical advisor Dave Key, and to the archivists at the Imperial War Museum and Southampton City Council. Thanks also to the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, to Alan Matlock, and to Rupert Rowbottom at the Nuffield Southampton Theatre. Music was by Public Service Broadcasting and Nick Thorburn. Our actors were Lee Ingleby, Helen Monk, Madeline Cross, Amber King, Wilf Scolding, Perdita Avery, and Ben Norris. And our grateful thanks, most of all, to the men and women who designed, built, and flew the Spitfire, the People's Plane.
Like, my kids are like, Mom, do you have a record? I'm like, I got one left.
Stacey Dragila now runs pole vault camps around the world. She was talking to me, Simon Watts, for that edition of Sporting Witness.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where Dame Tanni Gray-Thompson is celebrating the role of women in sporting history.
Catherine Switzer, Olga Corbett, Althea Gibson, just some of the names pivotal in getting women recognised in sport today.
I mean, that was the moment. That was the pinnacle. That was you reaching that Mount Everest.
Join me as I celebrate some of the sporting heroines of history.
At bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in an hour, join Nikki Beattie for the Arts Hour.
With Salma Hayek and Ryan Reynolds on Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard, Olga Kuryalenko talks to me about her role in Marvel's Black Widow, best-selling US author Karen Slaughter on why she loves a thriller, and Stanley Tucci on role swapping with Colin Firth.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Celia Hatton, and this programme is a story about the power of words in the making of modern China.
Long live the great teacher. Long live the great teacher.
For 100 years, slogans have been crucial to the Chinese Communist Party. Over decades, it's developed sophisticated ways to spread the word about new policies. The slogan's targets? The party's 95 million members, everyone spread across its vast territory, and you, even if you're living outside of China.
People of the world, unite and defeat the U.S. aggressors.
Slogans don't just reveal the blunt desires of party leaders. They also have a profound impact on the lives and the futures of hundreds of millions of people. So, after the news, join me as we look at 8 key slogans that tell the story of China's rise, from a country torn apart by civil war to a global superpower.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Thousands of emergency workers and volunteers continue to search for those still missing after some of the worst flooding to hit northwestern Europe in decades. More than 160 people are known to have died in Germany and Belgium, and hundreds more were injured. The German authorities have warned more victims may be found. Army vehicles have been helping to winch cars from out of the water and clear some of the vast piles of debris. Elmar Metzger is the spokesman for the fire service in Erfstadt, one of the worst affected towns.
We have motorways that have been destroyed, bridges that have collapsed, entire streets that have been swept away. It may take years before life in and around Erfstadt is back to normal.
On a visit to one of the towns, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier praised the solidarity people had shown. Afghan government sources have expressed optimism after the start of renewed peace negotiations with the Taliban in the Qatari capital Doha. But the long-stalled talks come amid growing concern about the country's future. This report by Lise Doucette.
In recent weeks, the Taliban have been overrunning districts across Afghanistan, fueling concern that they're bent on a military victory. But the Taliban spokesman Suhail Shaheen told me they still believe the only durable solution is a political one. But as the Taliban gain ground, they're also clarifying their political vision, a system which removes elections and brings in a new Islamic constitution and leadership. Afghan government negotiators insist they won't give up the achievements of the last 2 decades.
The Ethiopian police say they've arrested hundreds of people in the capital Addis Ababa, suspected of supporting Tigrayan rebels in the north of the country. The authorities have previously denied targeting people because of their ethnicity, despite continued reports of arbitrary arrests of Tigrayans. Mary Hopper reports.
Addis Ababa's police commissioner said 323 people suspected of helping the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front have been arrested. Some are also being investigated for allegedly possessing weapons, insulting the national flag, gambling and smoking cannabis. Businesses linked to the suspects have been shut down. Rights groups say some of the detained have been beaten and taken hundreds of kilometres away from the capital.
An opposition activist in Venezuela has taken refuge in the Chilean embassy amid a wave of arrests of political adversaries of President Nicolas Maduro. Emilio Guterres tweeted his thanks to those who'd saved him, while the Chilean Foreign Ministry said it had taken in the former mayor at the request of the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. The Venezuelan security forces have arrested the leader of the opposition party Popular Will and other party members. World News from the BBC. President Biden has said his administration will appeal against a ruling by a federal judge that a program protecting migrants who came to the US as children is illegal. Judge Andrew Hannon said the former President Barack Obama had exceeded his authority when he created the program by executive order, and that the government should stop accepting people onto the program. The Afghan government has called on Pakistan to ensure the safety of its diplomats and their families. The statement came after the daughter of the Afghan ambassador was assaulted and kidnapped in Islamabad. Sekunda Kamani reports.
According to a Pakistani police report, Salsala Ali Khail, daughter of the Afghan ambassador, was travelling in a taxi yesterday afternoon in Islamabad when another passenger got into the car and started beating her. She regained consciousness in a residential area with her hands and feet tied. The Afghan Foreign Ministry condemned the incident. Tensions between the neighbouring countries have been rising, with Afghan government representatives frequently accusing Pakistan of supporting the Taliban insurgency in the country, something Islamabad denies.
Austria says it's working with the United States to try to identify what might be causing a spate of unexplained illnesses among staff at the American embassy in Vienna. Many of the symptoms are similar to what's become known as Havana syndrome, a mystery brain illness first reported among US officials in Cuba 5 years ago. Reports suggest some 24 US staff could be affected. Scientists studying the genome of cannabis say it was first domesticated 12,000 years ago in China and not in Central Asia, as generally thought. They say the more specialised variants used now for textiles, medicine and as a recreational drug diverged from the main gene pool about 4,000 years ago. Human selection speeded up development. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Celia Hatton. And this is a programme about the power of words in the story of modern China, and how China's tenacious Communist Party has used words to shape the country. As we'll find, the party's political slogans reveal not just the ambitions of China's leaders, but can mean hope or fear for millions of people. For 15 years, I lived in China, working as a journalist. On my beloved sky blue bicycle, I'd ride to and from work along the capital's streets, gliding along wide boulevards with special bike lanes, and then through narrow laneways, zipping past parents taking their children to school or grandmas haggling over the price of vegetables. And there was one thing that was impossible to ignore. On my journey, I'd see slogan after slogan. Political messages printed on red banners, billboards, and ultimately massive electronic screens that rotate through several slogans, one after another.
爱国、创新、包容、厚德, patriotism, innovation, inclusiveness, virtue.
坚持科学，反对迷信 uphold science, eradicate superstition.
梦在前方，路在脚下. The path to the dream is under your feet.
And it's not just in the cities. The last time I was in China, in 2019, I spotted an anti-poverty banner on a mountaintop in the far western province of Gansu. 2 days later, I found similar signs back in Beijing. Even if you have no interest in the dreams and blunt desires of the Chinese Communist Party, the party is determined that you should know what they are. China's most politically savvy tried to predict which slogans, which 3 or 4 words, and sometimes excruciatingly dull speeches might signal the party's next major campaign. For communist weather forecasters, it pays to tell early on which way the wind is blowing. Such slogans really matter. Throughout history, they could mean life or death. This reliance on catchphrases endures because so much of the party's decision-making takes place behind firmly closed doors. Professor Vivian Xu of Oxford University has been studying the politics and society of China since the 1960s.
The party filters its options very much in-house and not in broad daylight, not out before the people's sight. Once it's made its decisions, it has a strong need to communicate those as clearly as possible, as unambiguously as possible, to the people at large. And everyone takes a reading of the way the winds may be blowing and where the energy is, where the hopes are still lodged and where they're no longer to be placed.
Once the campaign is decided, large sections of the party kick into gear to get the word out, so the message and its implicit instructions are heard not just by the general population, but also by far-flung local officials who might be tempted to deviate from the party line.
They have a whole internal apparatus devoted to explaining to local party members and local state officials what the key terms of a moment are.
Dr. Jennifer Alterhanger is an associate professor of Chinese history at Oxford University and an expert on Communist Party propaganda.
Usually they don't call them slogans because that term does not work in Chinese, but what they call them is so-called tifas, which are essentially best translated as formulations. And when a new formulation comes about, or a big speech has been made, or a new policy has been implemented, there will be numerous carefully drafted documents that explain this is the new formulation, this is what it means, this is how it can be explained to people, this is how it should be explained in newspapers, and this then gets circulated as a way of making, across a huge country, if you think about it, a central policy accessible and understandable. And that's not just to ordinary people, that's also to party and state officials themselves.
So to understand how Xi Jinping, China's current all-powerful president, rules over 20% of the world's population, and why the 95 million-member Chinese Communist Party is the most powerful political organization in the world, you need to look at the slogans. They're even starting to affect life way beyond China's borders. In this program, with help from the BBC archive, we'll look at 8 key slogans that tell us the party's and China's story. And to tell this tale, we have to go right back to the period when the party existed on the fringes, when it was headquartered in remote caves.
Chapter 1.
只有社会主义才能救中国. Only socialism can save China.
In 1921, young intellectuals established the party in bustling Shanghai, at a time when China was weak, with much of the country under the control of warlords. The small communist organization was soon forced to flee the city by the dominant nationalist regime. The communists established a new base in the remote countryside, but then, in 1937, a new threat.
News from the war front is almost all Japan sweeping forward, with more and more of her troops landing at Shanghai, pushing on towards Nanking and into the interior. China's resistance seems to be at an end, but is it? For the moment, Japan pursues her relentless course. Today, China's hills and valleys echo with Japan's cry of victory.
For a time, communists and nationalists worked together against the foreign invader. But following Japan's defeat in the Second World War, China's own civil war erupted again. From their base at Yan'an in central China, the communists focused on establishing their own vision for the country. The late American journalist Sidney Rittenberg was one of the few outsiders to visit. He spoke to the BBC in 2013.
You could walk right down that valley through the town of Yan'an and never know that anyone lived there because there were no houses. It had been totally bombed out by the Japanese, and the people lived in caves dug into the hillsides on either side of the valley. These clusters of caves is where all the work of leadership of the revolution all over China took place. And the instructions went out from those caves, and it was very free and open.
The party would operate from Yan'an for 12 years, gradually extending its power. Slogans were crucial.
It's out of those early years that, well, one of the major slogans of that time that did emerge was that only socialism will save China.
That sentiment spread quickly. Its creator, the party's commanding leader, Mao Zedong. He was a true political animal and a skilled communicator.
Mao Zedong was a large man, slightly leaned over on one side. He had one shoulder a bit higher than the other, and he was a kind of a Hulk. And he was the brain. He was the brain. He was the great analyzer. And he had a genius for encapsulating complex political or philosophical issues in very simple, popular phraseology.
One of the party's most enduring slogans, "Serve the people," also blossomed during this time. But crucially, it went hand in hand with another idea, the party's revolutionary vision over how it would govern that still exists today.
Chapter 2.
从群众中来到群众中去. From the masses to the masses.
After promising peasants they would be given their own land to use, thus doing away with hated landlords, the CCP secured huge support in the countryside and swept to power. In 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Communist Party was now in charge. And with that came a new slogan that communicated the radical new way the party was going to govern through a concept called the mass line. Jennifer Altahanger.
The mass line, which dates from 1943, is at its most popular in the 1950s and breaks down into the simple second slogan of "from the masses to the masses," and was the principle of governance by which the Chinese Communist Party would formulate policy by engaging closely with people across China and listening to their needs and their problems, and then formulates these into policies and returns them back to the masses and involve people, therefore, in implementing these policies once they had been created.
From the BBC archive, William Sewell remembers the profound impact that all this had at the time.
We had, as one of our members, the men who used to sweep our hallways and passages, and before would have never been consulted about anything if it had been noticed at all. But now he had a place among our discussions, so that there was a new emphasis on the poorer and the inarticulate. They were drawn into sharing in the government. They were made to feel that they were somebody. And of course, it seems to me that that was the real secret of the success of those early days, was that people were made to feel that they mattered.
But even in the 1950s, the new practices had mixed reviews.
Many did feel that they were involved in politics in ways that they had never been before. Others, of course, thought this to be an intrusion and found that it suddenly brought the government into their daily lives in ways that were unprecedented and, for many, deeply worrying.
Now, what's really interesting is this policy of the mass line is back in fashion. Dr. Olivia Chung, a research fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies China Institute, focuses her work on Xi Jinping's political philosophy.
Xi Jinping is very serious about the mass line. And the reason behind that is, he said, he need to maintain blood and flesh connections with the masses. That is the phrase he used. Now, Xi Jinping has formal requirements on how many days every party member should spend in the grassroots to mingle with the masses.
But some of the party's campaigns won't ever be welcomed back. In the mid-1950s came a flashpoint in China's history that would have far-reaching effects.
Chapter 3.
百花齐放，百家争鸣。Let 100 flowers bloom. Let 100 schools of thought contend.
February 1956, the Soviet Union suddenly turned to denounce its longtime ruler, Joseph Stalin. There were anti-Soviet uprisings in Hungary and Poland. Those political convulsions worried Mao and the rest of China's leadership, because until then, much of China's Communist Party had been modeled on the Stalinist Soviet system. That led Chinese leaders to decide to release any possible tensions that might be brewing on their turf.
It took them really months to decide that it would be safe and advisable to allow a modest opening up to criticism under this rubric of letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend.
And so the 100 Flowers campaign began. The late journalist and author Liu Binyan was a Communist Party member at the time. He spoke to the BBC in 1999.
From the spring of 1956 to the spring of 1957, that was a most crucial year for China. That could be a turning point. The majority of intellectuals believed in Mao's sincerity when Mao called on the people to criticize the party. We were so excited. We were so mobilized, Mao Zedong, you know. So we started to speak out.
Throughout the 100 Flowers, you see people saying, okay, so the Constitution says I have a right to the following, but here's what my daily life looks like. And a lot of people start criticizing what they increasingly feel is an increasingly entrenched party bureaucracy. So they start to criticize local officials for saying, well, ultimately, these local officials are really a bit fat cats who have just benefited from being the local party secretary, but they're not really doing what propaganda says they should be doing, namely serving the people.
The criticism was too much to handle for the party's leaders. It branded those who had spoken out as rightists, enemies of socialism, the party, and the people, as the British MP Christopher Mayhew reported to the BBC in 1957.
Earlier this year, criticism of the Communist Party had been invited, but had got out of hand, and now the government's counterattacking. While I was in China, the party was running a nationwide campaign against non-communist critics, calling them rightists, and the papers were full of it. Its propaganda is especially directed at the students. At the entrance to part of the university, I saw slogans saying, "We must struggle against the rightists."
They start to identify and label and put on trial and send to labor camps numerous people, many of whom really had seen themselves as supporters of the socialist project and of the party.
Liu Binyan was sent to be reformed through labor in the countryside, punishment for criticizing party bureaucracy. Many historians believe Mao didn't set out to use the 100 Flowers campaign as a way to ensnare political critics, but Liu Binyan believes he'd fallen into a trap set by the party elites.
It is the greatest deception in the history, I believe, in the history of communism. That's so skillfully prepared a betrayal of the people.
Here in Peking prison, very much a showplace, there are 1,400 inmates, most of them counter-revolutionaries serving an average sentence of 10 years.
Some of the prisoners here eating lunch are former school teachers and intellectuals. But most of the intellectuals who blossomed with criticism during the brief 100 Flowers movement have been sent to the countryside to do manual labor. The brainwashing is formidable. When I asked 6 of the most dangerous political prisoners what their crime was, each replied, "I was a reactionary." "What have you learned here?" I asked. "After a year's learning, I now see my errors."
The whole nation, immediately silenced, either within the party or out of the party. Everybody became so cautious, so careful in speaking out every opinion.
The man who was responsible for carrying out the crackdown was a certain Deng Xiaoping, a name that will resurface again later. The 100 Flowers exercise that Mao and Deng unleashed was never repeated.
What occurred in the aftermath of letting 100 flowers bloom was so decisively negative that it's a slogan that today is now used with a great deal of irony in many circles. It signals the boundaries, the limitations beyond which everyone who wishes to get along and be able to speak to power need to stay within.
Those boundaries would always remain in place, sometimes shifting, expanding, or contracting. But as we'll see through party history, those limitations never fully disappear.
Chapter 4.
两条腿走路 walking on two legs.
The fear generated by the backlash to the 100 Flowers campaign was still pulsing through China when Mao announced the country's next drive to engineer, through mass industrialization, a great leap in economic development that would allow China to overtake the West. That's a theme that also resonates in the party today. But in the 1950s, it led to one of the most devastating periods in recent Chinese history. The mobilization of millions behind one goal all began with slogans.
So I think one of my favorite, it's one of the famous slogans, but perhaps not the most famous, is the idea of walking on two legs, which describes the policy of the Great Leap Forward, namely that the Great Leap Forward was both about rapid advances in industry, that's one leg, and agriculture, that's the other leg. And that accelerated industrialization plus collectivization into communes in the countryside would increase harvests and ultimately fast-track China on the road towards socialism.
Since the days of the pyramids, human labor can hardly ever have been employed with such profusion as in modern China. On this one project, the building of a new dam, 45,000 Chinese men and women are toiling from sunrise to sunset. And they're doing it all without any kind of earth-moving machinery or equipment. In fact, practically with their bare hands.
I saw men and women working like this all over China. Some of these people would be on the project full-time. Others might be office workers who go out to build dams after normal working hours or at the weekends. All day long, the loudspeaker pours out propaganda music, and every day the workers must undergo at least an hour's political indoctrination. In the last year, the communists have launched a tremendous drive to organize the hundreds of millions of peasants into communes, thus making China a real Marxist state.
The leaders of communist China say that within the next 10 years, they will outstrip Britain's industrial capacity. The current slogan is, "We must overtake Britain."
The backyard blast furnace is really the symbol of modern China. It's her industrial revolution, the great leap forward into the 20th century.
But instead, there was a stunning decline in food production that few dared to acknowledge. Scarce resources were confiscated to meet unrealistic targets set at the top. And in the early 1960s, China confronted mass starvation. The Great Leap Forward campaign led to one of the most devastating famines ever recorded in human history.
In some areas, the agricultural situation is looking very bad. Farmers are not on the land because they've migrated to work in industries. And so very quickly, what initially looked like a utopian moment, a fast industrial and agricultural acceleration turns into disaster.
Journalist Joseph Yen talked to the BBC in 2013 about his memories of that time.
Every day is cabbage, cabbage, cabbage for a month. Really, everybody is starving, and, some people, the face will be swollen and the legs will be swollen, and it's really a very terrifying time.
Anywhere between 15 and 40 million people died. The party's final estimate remains a state secret. The misery caused by the Great Leap Forward led Mao to retreat from the spotlight for a period, but not for long. And as we'll see in part 2 after the news, Mao was preparing to mount a political comeback that would unleash the most frenetic round of internal, psychological, and physical violence the party has witnessed to date.
This is the BBC World Service, where international economist Jim O'Neill continues his look at the post-COVID challenges facing the US.
After the shock of the pandemic, America's economy is surging.
One of the lessons of COVID has been that the United States has much more financing power at its disposal than we thought.
But this upturn might come at a price.
I think we'll get another sharp decline in the dollar. We've already seen the first stages of this.
There's intense debates about the possibility of inflation of the kind that we haven't seen since the 1970s.
In part 2, could the dollar's position as the dominant currency of the world finally be tested? And what impact could China have on the US recovery?
America sort of opened the doors in the 2000s and welcomed China in and ended up losing.
The US is caught up in a dangerous set of false narratives in creating a problem with China that goes well beyond what it should.
The Test, Wednesday at 8 and 19 GMT.
We're tracing the rise of China's Communist Party by looking at 8 key political slogans. Coming up in part 2, how those phrases played a major role in the turbulent story of modern China. From times of turmoil to economic supremacy. And how even people living outside China are prime targets for today's slogans. That's coming up in just a few minutes. First, a summary of today's world news.
BBC News with Moira Alderson. Emergency work is continuing in Germany and the Benelux countries, which earlier in the week were hit by the worst floods in decades. At least 160 people are known to have died, most of them in Western Germany, and officials have warned that more bodies may be found in submerged cars and collapsed buildings. Both sides have sounded a note of cautious optimism at the start of a new round of peace talks between the Afghan government and Taliban militants. The negotiations in Doha take place amid the Taliban seizing more government districts. More than 300 people have been arrested in Ethiopia, accused of supporting rebels in the northern region of Tigray. Reports say some of them have been beaten up and taken hundreds of kilometres from the capital. A Venezuelan opposition activist has sought asylum in the Chilean embassy after the government started arresting its adversaries, among them the leader and other members of the Popular Will Party. Chile says it gave refuge to Emilio Graterol at the request of the opposition leader Juan Guaido. The Greek authorities are reimposing an overnight curfew and other restrictions on Mykonos to try to bring a new COVID outbreak under control. The island's economy is heavily dependent on visitors, and the move, in the middle of the tourist season, has been criticised as misguided. President Biden says he will appeal against a court ruling that declared the Dreamers program illegal. The program protects people who entered the United States as illegal child migrants. The latest